Every muscle in my body ached as I hunched over the keyboard, the fluorescent lights of Castellano Enterprises casting harsh shadows across the endless stack of paperwork that had become my existence. The metallic taste of blood lingered on my tongue from where I'd bitten it to keep from crying out earlier, when Marcus's latest outburst had left me with a bruised rib that protested with each breath I took. The familiar weight of concealer felt heavy beneath my eyes, carefully applied to hide the purple shadows that had nothing to do with lack of sleep, and everything to do with the man I'd foolishly thought loved me. The scent of expensive coffee and leather permeated the 23rd floor of the sleek Manhattan high-rise, a stark contrast to the cheap instant coffee I could barely afford in my cramped studio apartment. My fingers trembled slightly as I typed, partly from exhaustion, and partly from the constant state of hypervigilance that had become my norm. Every sound in the corridor made me jump. Every voice that carried through the glass walls of the executive offices sent my pulse racing. Not because I feared my boss. Dominic Castellano was demanding but fair, but because fear had become my default setting. I pressed my palm against my ribs where the pain flared with each shallow breath. Marcus had been particularly violent last night after I'd mentioned working late again. He didn't like it when I stayed at the office past 6, claimed I was trying to attract attention from other men. The irony wasn't lost on me. I went out of my way to remain invisible, to blend into the beige walls and polished marble floors like a ghost haunting the corridors of corporate power. The elevator dinged softly, and I heard the familiar sound of expensive Italian leather shoes against marble. Mr. Castellano always arrived at exactly 8:30, his routine as precise as everything else about him. I'd been his secretary for 8 months now, and in that time, I'd learned to read his moods by the weight of his footsteps. Today, they sounded heavier than usual, purposeful in a way that made my stomach clench with anxiety. "Good morning, Elena." His voice was smooth, cultured with just a hint of an accent that spoke of old money and older traditions. I looked up from my computer screen, forcing what I hoped was a professional smile, despite the way my lip pulled at the small cut Marcus's ring had left there. "Good morning, Mr. Castellano. Your 9 o'clock appointment with the Marino Group has been moved to 10:30 at their request. The contracts you asked for are on your desk, and the quarterly reports from the Chicago office arrived this morning." My voice sounded steadier than I felt. A small victory in a life that had become a series of small defeats. He paused beside my desk, and I could smell his cologne. Something expensive and masculine that made me think of safety, though I couldn't explain why. When I dared to glance up, his dark eyes were studying me with an intensity that made my breath catch. There was something different about his expression today. A sharpness that went beyond his usual professional scrutiny. "You look tired," he said quietly, and there was something in his tone that made my chest tight. Not criticism, but concern. I wasn't used to concern. "I'm fine, sir. Just a busy week." The lie came easily now, as practiced as the concealer routine. I'd become an expert at fine, at managing expectations, at making myself small enough that no one would look too closely. But Dominic Castellano was looking closely. His gaze lingered on my face for a moment longer than was professionally appropriate, and I saw something flicker in his expression, a darkness that had nothing to do with displeasure, and everything to do with recognition. He'd built an empire on reading people, on seeing the things they tried to hide. I should have known that my carefully constructed facade wouldn't fool him forever. "I'll be in meetings most of the day," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Hold my calls unless it's urgent." I nodded, already turning back to my computer screen, but I could feel his presence lingering. When I finally heard his office door close with a soft click, I allowed myself to slump slightly in my chair, my ribs protesting the movement. The morning stretched ahead of me like a minefield. Documents to type, calls to field, the constant effort of pretending that my life wasn't slowly disintegrating around me. By lunch, The pain in my side had intensified to the point where I could barely concentrate. I'd skipped breakfast again. Not from any eating disorder, but because buying groceries meant less money for the increasing demands Marcus made on my paycheck. He'd started taking my debit card more frequently, claiming he needed it for job interviews, though I suspected the money was going toward the bottles that seemed to multiply in our apartment like a plague. I was reaching for a file in the bottom drawer when the movement sent a sharp spike of agony through my torso. The gasp that escaped my lips was involuntary, and I pressed my hand to my side, closing my eyes against the wave of dizziness that followed. "Elena?" I hadn't heard him approach, but when I opened my eyes, Mr. Castellano was standing beside my desk, his expression darker than I'd ever seen it. There was something dangerous in his stillness, a predatory quality that should have frightened me, but somehow didn't. "I'm fine," I said automatically, trying to straighten in my chair. "Just moved too quickly." His eyes dropped to where my hand was pressed against my ribs, and I saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. When he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "Stand up." It wasn't a request. The authority in his tone was absolute, the kind of command that brooked no argument. I rose slowly, fighting another wave of dizziness, and his gaze tracked every minute movement, every wince I couldn't quite suppress. "Lift your shirt." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Sir, now." There was no room for argument in that single syllable. No space for the protest that died on my lips. With shaking hands, I raised the hem of my blouse just enough to reveal the angry purple-black bruise that stretched across my ribs, like an abstract painting done in pain. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched Dominic's face transform, watched something cold and terrible settle in his features. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and for a moment I caught a glimpse of the man beneath the polished businessman, someone capable of violence that would make Marcus's petty cruelties look like child's play. "Who did this to you?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more menace than any shout. I lowered my shirt with shaking hands, unable to meet his eyes. "I fell down the stairs. I'm clumsy." "Don't." The single word cut through my explanation like a blade. Don't insult my intelligence with lies. The tears I'd been holding back for weeks suddenly threatened to spill over. In 8 months of working for him, Dominic had never been anything but professional. But there was something in his voice now that spoke of protection, of a man who had just seen something that offended him on a fundamental level. "It's not your concern, Mr. Castellano." I managed, wrapping my arms around myself as if I could hold the pieces of my dignity together, through sheer force of will. He stepped closer, close enough that I could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, close enough to catch the faint scent of his cologne mingled with something more primal. Anger barely leashed and entirely focused on my behalf. "You're wrong," he said quietly. "You are very much my concern." Before I could process what he meant, what the implications of that statement might be, his phone rang. The shrill sound cut through the tension like a knife, and I reached for it automatically, grateful for the interruption. "Castellano Enterprises, Mr. Castellano's office." "Is he there?" The voice was gruff, impatient. "This is Detective Rodriguez. We need to speak with him about the ongoing investigation." I looked up at Mr. Castellano, whose expression had shifted into something unreadable. He held out his hand for the phone, and I passed it to him, trying not to think about how his fingers brushed mine or the way that simple contact sent warmth shooting up my arm. "Detective," he said smoothly, but I caught the slight tension in his shoulders. "What can I do for you?" As he spoke, I tried to focus on the computer screen, on anything other than the conversation taking place mere feet from my desk. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in those few minutes, that the careful balance I'd maintained for months was about to crumble entirely. When he hung up, Mr. Castellano's attention returned to me with laser focus. "I have to go out for a few hours. When I get back, we're going to have a conversation." It wasn't a suggestion, and I nodded mutely, already dreading whatever that conversation might entail. As he gathered his coat and briefcase, I caught him looking at me one more time, and there was something in his expression that made my heart race for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. "Elena," he said from the doorway, his voice soft but carrying an unmistakable promise. "This isn't over." After he left, I sat alone in the quiet office, my hand unconsciously drifting to my bruised ribs. For the first time in months, I felt something other than resignation settling in my chest. It might have been hope, or it might have been terror. In my world, they'd become indistinguishable. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of nervous energy and mounting dread. Every time the elevator chimed, my heart jumped, thinking Mr. Castellano had returned. Every phone call made me wonder if it was Marcus checking up on me with that particular brand of paranoia that had intensified over the past few weeks. The bruise on my ribs throbbed in rhythm with my pulse, a constant reminder of the previous night's violence and the conversation that awaited me. At exactly 5:30, I began shutting down my computer and organizing my desk for the next day. The familiar routine providing a small measure of comfort. Most of the other administrative staff had already left, their voices and laughter fading as they headed to happy hours and dinner dates. Normal lives that seemed as foreign to me as life on another planet. I envied them their freedom, their ability to look forward to the evening instead of dreading what waited at home. I was gathering my purse when I heard the distinctive sound of Mr. Castellano's footsteps in the corridor. My movement stilled, and I felt that familiar tension coil in my stomach. Through the glass walls of his office, I could see him approaching, his expression unreadable but purposeful. He wasn't alone. 2 men in expensive suits flanked him, their posture suggesting they were more than simple business associates. "Elena," his voice carried that same quiet authority from earlier, and I straightened automatically. "Please come into my office." It wasn't a request, and I followed him on unsteady legs, hyper-aware of the 2 men who remained in the outer office, but whose presence felt like a physical weight. Mr. Castellano closed the door behind us with a soft click that somehow felt final, and I found myself alone with him in the space that had always felt so safe before. His office was a study in understated power, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, dark wood furniture that spoke of old money, and artwork that I suspected was worth more than I made in a year. But tonight, it felt different. There was an energy in the room that made my skin prickle with awareness, a sense that whatever conversation we were about to have would change everything. "Sit," he said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs positioned in front of his massive desk. I perched on the edge of the seat, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, and watched as he moved around to lean against the front of his desk. The position put him closer to me than was strictly professional, close enough that I could see the way his jaw tightened as he studied my face. "Tell me about him," he said without preamble. "The man who put his hands on you." The directness of the question sent a flush of shame through me, hot and acidic. "Mr. Castellano, I appreciate your concern, but this really isn't his name." The words cut through my deflection like a blade, and there was something in his tone that spoke of barely controlled violence. "Give me his name." I stared at him, taking in the way his hands gripped the edge of his desk, the rigid set of his shoulders beneath his expensive suit. There was nothing soft about Dominic Castellano in that moment. Nothing that suggested the civilized businessman who signed my paychecks. This was someone else entirely. Someone dangerous in ways I was only beginning to understand. "Marcus," I whispered, the name feeling like a betrayal on my lips. "Marcus Bennett." He nodded once, a sharp movement that somehow felt like a verdict being passed. How long? 6 months. The words came out small and broken, and I hated myself for the weakness they revealed. It wasn't always like this. He was different in the beginning. They always are. His voice carried a weight of knowledge that made me look at him more closely. There was something in his expression that spoke of experience with violence, with the kinds of men who hurt women. Where does he work? The questions kept coming, each one delivered with the same quiet intensity, and I found myself answering despite every instinct that screamed at me to stay silent. He pulled details from me with surgical precision. Marcus's workplace, his schedule, his habits, the patterns of his violence. With each revelation, I watched something harden in Mr. Castellano's features, something cold and implacable settling over him like armor. Why haven't you left? The question was gentler than the others, but it hit me like a physical blow. Where would I go? The words tumbled out before I could stop them. Months of trapped desperation, finally finding voice. He knows where I work, where my mother lives. He's threatened to find me if I leave, and I believe him. I stopped, unable to voice the rest of it. The way Marcus's jealousy had grown into something monstrous. The way he'd started talking about making sure no other man would ever want me. Mr. Castellano was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was deadly soft. He's what, Elena? I met his eyes, seeing something there that should have terrified me, but instead made me feel safer than I had in months. He's sick in ways that go beyond just hitting me. He talks about permanent solutions, making sure I can never leave him. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. I watched as Mr. Castellano straightened, his movements predatory and precise, and I caught a glimpse of the man he must have been before the expensive suits and corporate respectability, someone who understood violence intimately, who could wield it with the same precision he brought to his business dealings. That's not going to happen, he said quietly, and there was such absolute certainty in his voice that I almost believed him. Not while you're under my protection. The words should have confused me, should have raised questions about why my boss was involving himself in my personal life. Instead, they sent a wave of relief through me so powerful it was almost painful. For the first time in months, someone was offering to stand between me and the growing threat that had become my life. I can't ask you to... You're not asking. He moved then, coming around the desk to crouch in front of my chair, bringing himself to my eye level. The gesture was unexpectedly gentle, but there was nothing soft about the intensity in his dark eyes. This isn't about what you're asking for. This is about what I'm choosing to give. His proximity was overwhelming. The scent of his cologne, the way his suit pulled across his broad shoulders, the calluses on his hands that spoke of a past very different from his current corporate image. There was something about Dominic Castellano that called to a part of me I'd forgotten existed. The part that had once believed in protection and safety, and men who kept their promises. Why? The question slipped out before I could stop it, and I saw something flicker across his features. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. Because some things shouldn't be tolerated, he said simply, and because you deserve better than to live in fear. Before I could respond, there was a soft knock on the door. One of the men from the outer office entered without waiting for permission, his expression respectful but urgent. Sir, we have the information you requested. Mr. Castellano rose smoothly, his demeanor shifting back into that of the businessman I knew, but I caught the way his hands flexed at his sides, the subtle tension that suggested barely leashed action. Marcus Bennett, the man continued, consulting a small notepad, works the night shift at Patterson's warehouse on the west side, gets off at 7 a.m., Usually stops at the Lakeside Diner for coffee before heading home to the apartment on Madison Street. I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized they'd been watching him, gathering intelligence with the kind of efficiency that spoke of resources far beyond what any legitimate businessman should possess. The pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known I was solving clicked into place. The deference his employees showed him. The way certain clients spoke to him with a mixture of respect and fear. The fact that Detective Rodriguez had called him about an investigation. "Thank you, Leo." Mr. Castellano's voice was steady, but I caught the undercurrent of something darker. "That will be all for now." After the man left, the silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken implications. I stared at Mr. Castellano, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time, understanding that the man who signed my paychecks was capable of things that existed far outside the boundaries of corporate law. "You're not just a businessman," I said quietly, and it wasn't a question. He met my gaze steadily, and there was no attempt at denial in his expression. "No, I'm not." "Should I be afraid of you?" The question hung in the air between us, and I watched as something shifted in his features, something almost vulnerable appearing beneath the controlled exterior. "I would never hurt you," he said. And there was such quiet sincerity in his voice that I believed him without question. But I can't say the same about others who threaten what's mine. The possessive note in his voice should have alarmed me, should have sent me running toward the door. Instead, it sent warmth spreading through my chest. A feeling I hadn't experienced in so long, I'd almost forgotten what it was like to feel wanted rather than simply tolerated. "I should go home," I said, though the words felt hollow. Home wasn't home anymore. It was a battlefield where I was always losing. "No." The word was gentle but absolute. "You should go to your apartment, pack what you need, and then you should disappear for a while." "I can't just disappear. I have work, responsibilities." "You have vacation days," he interrupted smoothly. "Consider this an extended break. With full pay, of course." The careful way he phrased it told me this wasn't really a choice, that the concern in his voice was backed by the kind of authority that didn't accept arguments. Part of me wanted to protest, to insist on handling my own problems, but a larger part was simply grateful that someone was finally offering me a way out of the endless cycle of fear and violence. Where would I go? Something that might have been satisfaction flickered across his features. "Leave that to me." The hotel room Mr. Castellano had arranged for me was nothing like what I'd expected. Instead of some seedy motel on the outskirts of town, I found myself in a suite at the Sterling, one of Manhattan's most exclusive hotels. The marble bathroom was larger than my entire apartment, and the view from the floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the glittering expanse of Central Park, spread out below like a tapestry of lights and shadows. I stood at those windows now, watching the city move beneath me while my mind raced with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. It had been 18 hours since Mr. Castellano's men had escorted me to pack a single bag. 18 hours since I'd sent a text to Marcus claiming I was visiting my sick aunt in Philadelphia. The lie came easily. I'd become an expert at deception over the past 6 months. But the guilt that usually accompanied such untruths was noticeably absent. The knock on the door made me jump despite expecting it. Mr. Castellano had said he would come by to check on me, to discuss next steps, though I suspected the conversation would be far more complicated than those simple words implied. I opened the door to find him standing there, looking as impeccably dressed as always, but somehow different in this intimate setting. "May I come in?" His voice carried that same careful politeness, but there was something those eyes that suggested the formality was for my benefit. "Who are you?" The question came out softer than I'd intended, carrying more vulnerability than I'd meant to show. "Really?" He was quiet for a long moment, and I watched something shift in his expression, as if he were weighing how much truth I could handle. When he spoke, his voice carried a formality that suggested he was sharing information he rarely disclosed. "My family has been in the import business for 3 generations," he said carefully. "We specialize in ensuring that valuable items reach their intended destinations safely, regardless of the obstacles that might arise." The euphemisms were elegant, but I understood what he wasn't saying. The Castellano family wasn't just in the import business. They were in the control business, the power business, the kind of enterprise that operated in the spaces between legal and illegal, where most people feared to tread. "And I work for you," another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. "You work for my legitimate business interests," he corrected gently. "Castellano Enterprises is exactly what it appears to be. A successful import company with offices in 6 countries and a reputation for discretion and efficiency. But it's not all you do." "No," he admitted, "it's not all I do." The silence stretched between us, and I found myself studying his face, looking for signs of the violence I knew he was capable of. But all I saw was the same careful attention he'd always shown me. The quiet consideration that had made working for him such a relief after the chaos that had become my personal life. "Are you afraid of me now?" he asked quietly, and there was something almost vulnerable in the question. I considered it seriously, examining my feelings with the same care I'd once used to navigate Marcus's moods. The logical part of my mind insisted I should be terrified, that I should be planning my escape from this elegant room and the dangerous man who'd arranged my stay here. But the emotional truth was more complicated. "No," I said finally, surprised by my own honesty. "I should be, but I'm not." "Why?" The question was simple, but the answer was anything but. I thought about the way he'd looked at my bruises, the controlled fury in his voice when he demanded Marcus's name. I thought about the careful way he'd arranged my escape, the concern in his voice when he'd insisted I needed to eat. "Because you could have hurt me months ago if that was your intention," I said slowly, working through the realization as I spoke. "Because you've been nothing but respectful even when you had every opportunity to take advantage. Because when you found out someone was hurting me, your first instinct was to protect me, not to use my vulnerability for your own benefit." Something shifted in his expression, a warmth that transformed his features from merely handsome to something approaching beautiful. It was the first time I'd seen him without the careful mask of professional distance, and the effect was startling. "You're remarkable," he said softly, and there was such sincerity in his voice that it made my chest tight. "Most people in your situation would be looking for the nearest exit. Most people in my situation don't have anywhere to go." The words came out more bitter than I'd intended, carrying months of trapped desperation. "Most people in my situation don't have someone powerful enough to make the monsters disappear." "Is that what you think I am?" His voice was carefully neutral, but I caught something else underneath. Hope, perhaps, or the need for reassurance. "Someone powerful enough to keep the monsters away?" I met his gaze, seeing past the expensive suit and cultured voice to the man beneath. There was darkness there, certainly the capacity for violence that I'd witnessed firsthand. But there was also protection, the kind of strength that could be wielded as a shield rather than a weapon. "I think you're someone who decides what he wants, and then makes it happen," I said carefully. "The question is what you want from me." The smile that crossed his features was slow and predatory, but somehow it didn't frighten me. Instead, it sent heat spiraling through my chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the way he was looking at me, as if I were something precious rather than broken. "I want you safe," he said simply. "Everything else is negotiable." 3 days passed in the luxury of the Sterling suite. 3 days of room service meals I didn't have to cook and sleep that wasn't interrupted by the sound of Marcus's key in the lock. I found myself sleeping through the night for the first time in months, waking naturally instead of to the sound of angry voices or the crash of bottles against walls. The absence of fear was almost disorienting, like learning to walk again after an injury I hadn't realized was so debilitating. Mr. Castellano visited each evening, bringing news from the outside world and carefully neutral updates about the search for Marcus Bennett. The police had classified him as a missing person, but there was little urgency in their investigation. Men like Marcus disappeared all the time in a city like New York, and without evidence of foul play, his case would likely fade into the background of more pressing concerns. "The lease on your apartment expires at the end of the month," he said during his Thursday evening visit, settling into the chair across from me with the casual ease of someone who belonged in elegant surroundings. "I took the liberty of having my people pack your belongings?" I looked up from the book I'd been pretending to read, a thriller whose violence seemed tame compared to my current reality. "Where will you put them?" "That depends on you." He leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes intent. "I have a proposition." The word sent a flutter of something through my chest. Anticipation, perhaps, or the recognition that whatever he was about to offer would change everything irrevocably. I set the book aside and gave him my full attention, hyper-aware of the way the lamplight cast shadows across his sharp features. "I'm listening." "I need someone I can trust in my personal life," he said carefully, his voice carrying the weight of a practiced negotiation. "Someone to manage my household, handle my private correspondence, ensure that my home runs smoothly. The position would require absolute discretion and complete loyalty." The words were chosen with legal precision, but I heard what he wasn't saying. He wasn't offering me a job. He was offering me a place in his world, a position that would put me under his protection permanently. The realization should have frightened me, but instead it filled me with a relief so profound it was almost painful. "What would that involve exactly?" I asked, though I suspected the details were less important than the underlying offer of safety. "You would live in my penthouse," he said, watching my face carefully for any sign of distress. "You would have your own wing, complete privacy when you wanted it. Your official title would be personal assistant, but your actual responsibilities would be whatever you're comfortable with." The careful way he phrased it told me he understood the vulnerability of my situation, the fact that I might not be ready for the kind of intimacy his protection implied. It was a consideration I hadn't expected from a man capable of making people disappear, and it made something warm unfurl in my chest. "And in exchange?" "In exchange, you would be under my protection. No one would touch you, threaten you, or cause you pain without answering to me." His voice carried an edge of steel that reminded me exactly how dangerous he could be when protecting what he considered his. "You would be safe, Elena. Completely safe." The promise hung between us, simple and absolute. I thought about my cramped apartment with its broken lock, about the job that barely paid enough to cover rent, about the constant fear that had become my normal. Then I thought about the luxury of the past 3 days. The peace of sleeping without nightmares, the way Mr. Castellano looked at me as if I were something valuable rather than disposable. What if I want to leave? The question came out smaller than I'd intended, carrying the weight of every bad decision I'd made in the past year. "Then you leave." His answer was immediate, unequivocal. "With a generous severance package and my assurance that you'll never be bothered by anyone from my world again." The sincerity in his voice was startling. Men like Marcus made promises that turned into chains. But there was something different about the way Mr. Castellano spoke, a quality that suggested his word was his bond in ways that transcended legal contracts. "Why me?" I asked, though part of me was afraid of the answer. You could have anyone. Someone with better qualifications, more experience. Because I've spent 8 months watching you handle pressure with grace, he said, his voice soft but certain. Because you're intelligent enough to see past the surface of things, loyal enough to be trusted with sensitive information, and strong enough to survive what should have broken you. Because when I look at you, I see someone worth protecting. The words hit me like a physical touch, warm and startling in their honesty. I'd spent so long being told I was worthless that I was lucky anyone would want me, that hearing myself described as valuable felt like stepping into sunlight after months in darkness. And because, he continued, his voice dropping to something more intimate, I find myself caring about your well-being in ways that go beyond professional interest. The admission hung between us, loaded with implications I wasn't sure I was ready to explore. There was something in his eyes that spoke of desire, carefully held in check, of a want that was tempered by respect for my circumstances and the trauma I was still processing. I need time to think, I said, though even as the words left my lips, I knew what my answer would be. The alternative was returning to a life of fear and poverty, of looking over my shoulder and flinching at every unexpected sound. Compared to that, accepting Dominic Castellano's protection seemed less like a choice and more like salvation. Of course. He rose smoothly, reaching into his jacket to withdraw a black credit card that he placed on the table between us. Take all the time you need. In the meantime, this will cover anything you require. I stared at the card, understanding that it represented more than just purchasing power. It was a demonstration of trust, a gesture that said he was willing to invest in me before I'd even agreed to his terms. The faith implicit in that offering was both humbling and terrifying. Mr. Castellano? Dominic, he corrected gently. I think we're past formalities, don't you? The use of his first name felt like crossing a threshold, acknowledging that whatever relationship we were building existed outside the boundaries of employer and employee. When I looked up at him, I saw something in his expression that made my breath catch. A heat that was carefully controlled but unmistakably present. Dominic, I repeated, testing the name on my lips. What happens if I say yes? Then tomorrow we go to my penthouse and you see what your new life could look like. He moved toward the door, then paused, looking back at me with an intensity that made my pulse race. And Elena, I hope very much that you say yes. After he left, I sat alone in the elegant suite, turning the credit card over in my hands and thinking about the choice I was facing. In the space of a week, my entire world had shifted on its axis. The man I'd feared was gone, erased as completely as if he'd never existed. The job I'd clung to for survival had transformed into something that resembled a fairy tale, and the boss I'd thought I understood had revealed himself to be someone far more complex and dangerous than I'd ever imagined. I thought about my mother alone in her assisted living facility, with only my sporadic visits to break the monotony. With Dominic's resources, I could ensure she received the best care available, could visit her without worrying about the cost of travel or time away from work. I thought about the constant ache of hunger I'd grown accustomed to, the way I'd learned to make a single meal stretch across 2 days. In Dominic's world, such concerns would be meaningless. But mostly I thought about safety. Real, absolute safety, the kind I'd almost forgotten existed. No more checking locks twice before bed. No more avoiding eye contact with strangers on the subway. No more carefully concealing bruises and pretending that everything was fine. The promise of such peace was almost too good to believe. When I finally went to bed that night, I dreamed of marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows, of strong hands that offered protection instead of pain, of dark eyes that looked at me as if I were something precious. For the first time in longer than I could remember, My dreams were filled with hope instead of fear. The next morning, I called the number on Dominic's business card and spoke the words that would change everything. "I accept your offer." His response was immediate, warm with satisfaction, and something deeper that sent heat spiraling through my chest. "I'll pick you up at noon. Wear something comfortable. We have a lot to discuss." As I prepared for the day that would mark the beginning of my new life, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror and was startled by what I saw. The hollow-cheeked, hollow-eyed woman who had looked back at me for months was gone, replaced by someone who looked almost hopeful. The bruises had faded to yellow shadows, barely visible beneath the concealer I no longer needed to apply with trembling hands. It's a responsibility. For both of us. He pulled back to look at me. It means you can't be careless with your safety. It means accepting security measures that might feel restrictive. It means understanding that there will always be people who see you as a potential weakness to exploit. But there will also always be you, standing between them and me. Yes, always. I reached up to cup his face, feeling the slight stubble on his jaw, the warmth of his skin. Then I accept all of it, the responsibility, the restrictions, the risks, because the alternative is living half a life, always afraid, always alone. He kissed me then, deep and possessive, acclaiming that I welcomed. When we broke apart, I saw the heat in his eyes tempered by something softer. Love, real and undeniable. I have to go to the office, he said reluctantly, but I'm assigning 2 of my best people to stay with you today. Consider it a precaution until tonight is handled. I thought I was safe here. You are, but I'm not taking any chances. He pressed his lips to my forehead. Humor me. I nodded, understanding that his need to protect me wasn't about control, but about care. What should I do today? Whatever you want. Read, relax, explore the penthouse. There's a gym on the 3rd floor if you want to work out. Or you could visit your mother. I can have a car and security team ready in 20 minutes. The casual mention of my mother, the ease with which he offered resources that would have been impossible for me to access before, still took my breath away. Maybe I'll do that. She'd probably like some company. Take your time, and Elena. He paused at the doorway, looking back at me with such intensity it made my heart skip. Thank you for trusting me with this. With us. After he left, I stood alone in the massive kitchen, surrounded by luxury and safety, and realized that for the first time in my adult life, I was exactly where I wanted to be. The path here had been dark and painful, but standing on the other side of that darkness, I could finally see the light. I spent the day with my mother, who looked better than she had in months. The facility Dominic had arranged was worlds apart from the cramped, institutional place she'd been in before. Her room was spacious and bright, decorated with her favorite things, and the staff treated her with genuine kindness. You look different, she said, studying my face with the clarity she sometimes possessed between the fog of her condition. Happier. I am, I admitted. Things have changed. That man who arranged this, she gestured around the beautiful room. He's good to you? Yes, Mama. He's very good to me. She took my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. Then don't let fear make you push him away. I spent too many years afraid of my own happiness. Don't make my mistakes. Her words stayed with me during the drive back to the penthouse, through the afternoon hours as I waited for evening to fall. The 2 security guards Dominic had assigned stayed discreetly in the background, present but not intrusive, a reminder of the reality of the life I'd chosen. Dominic returned just after 7, and I knew immediately from his expression that it was done. Vincent Russo was no longer a threat. He came to me without a word, pulling me into his arms, and I held him, understanding that taking a life, even a life that deserved ending, left marks on the soul. Are you okay? I asked quietly. I am now. He pulled back to look at me, searching my face for signs of fear or regret. Are you? I considered the question seriously. A man was dead because of me, because I'd given the word. The old Elena would have been horrified, would have drowned in guilt. But the woman I'd become understood that sometimes survival required hard choices. Yes, I said finally. I'm okay. Relief flooded his features. I was afraid you'd hate me for making you part of this. You didn't make me part of anything. I chose this, chose you, chose to fight for the life I want. I rose on my toes to kiss him. No regrets. Later that night, lying in his arms in his massive bed, a boundary we'd finally crossed, I stared up at the ceiling and thought about how far I'd come. From victim to survivor to something else entirely. A partner to a dangerous man, yes, but also someone who'd reclaimed her own power, her own voice. "What are you thinking?" Dominic's voice was drowsy, content. That I never imagined my life could feel like this. Safe. Happy. Wanted. His arms tightened around me. "Get used to it. Because I'm never letting you go." And for the first time in longer than I could remember, the idea of forever didn't terrify me. It filled me with hope.